For decades, we've pictured climate change as melting icebergs and rising seas. We've seen the satellite images and the graphs trending upwards, but that story has been missing a crucial, terrifying chapter, a chapter that isn't taking place in the atmosphere or the oceans, but right under our feet. This frozen ground underpins about a quarter of all the land in the northern hemisphere, and it is failing. Not slowly, not gracefully, but in sudden, catastrophic collapses. The very fabric of the Arctic landscape is tearing apart, and what's pouring out of the wound will affect not just the few million people who live here, but every single person on this planet. This isn't some distant future problem. This is a geological emergency, and it's happening right now. The word thaw is just too gentle for what's happening up here. It brings to mind a pleasant spring day, the slow melting of snow. What scientists are witnessing is something else entirely. They call it abrupt thaw, and it is every bit as violent as it sounds. Picture the concrete foundation of a skyscraper suddenly turning to liquid mud. The entire structure would warp, buckle, and then collapse. That is precisely what is happening to the ground across millions of square miles. You see, permafrost isn't just frozen dirt, it's a complex mix of soil, gravel, and rock, all held together by ice. In many areas, especially in Siberia and Alaska, this ground is incredibly ice-rich. It's less like frozen soil and more like soil suspended inside a solid block of ice. For thousands of years, this ice has been the structural support, the literal skeleton of the landscape. But, with the Arctic warming at a rate up to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet, that skeleton is melting. The results are as surreal as they are devastating. Scientists have a name for this topsy-turvy landscape: thermokarst. In reality, it's just chaos. Entire forests of spruce and birch become drunken forests, with their trunks tilting at wild angles as the ground beneath them sinks and shifts. Hillsides that have been stable for 10,000 years can suddenly liquefy, slumping downwards in massive landslides of mud and rock. In some places, the collapse is even more dramatic. Huge underground wedges of ice, some the size of apartment buildings, are melting away, leaving behind enormous voids. The land above simply falls in, creating vast gaping craters known as thaw slumps or thermokarst lakes. We've seen satellite images of these features expanding with terrifying speed. Land that was covered in forest just a few years ago is now unrecognizable, submerged under newly formed lakes that bubble with escaping gas. This isn't some fringe phenomenon. Scientists are now realizing that these abrupt collapses aren't factored into most climate models, which tend to assume a slow, gradual thaw from the surface down. The reality is that instead of a few centimeters of soil thawing each year, several meters of ground can become destabilized in a matter of days. This process is fundamentally reshaping the Arctic. Rivers that once ran clear are now choked with sediment from collapsing banks. Coastlines are eroding at an alarming pace, not just from the sea, but from the land itself caving in. The very ground that has defined the North for eons is becoming a soupy, unpredictable mess, a landscape in the grips of a violent transformation. The physical collapse of the landscape is just the opening act. The main event is invisible, a flood of ancient carbon pouring into our atmosphere. The world's permafrost holds an estimated 1.7 trillion tons of carbon, locked away as the frozen, undecomposed remains of ancient plants and animals. To put that into perspective, that is roughly twice the amount of carbon currently in our entire atmosphere. For as long as it has remained frozen, this immense carbon vault has been stable. But as the ground thaws and collapses, that freezer door is being thrown wide open. When this ancient organic material is exposed to air and water, microbes that have been dormant for millennia spring back to life. They immediately begin to decompose the material, and the byproducts of their feast are carbon dioxide and methane. Carbon dioxide is bad enough, but methane is a greenhouse gas with a serious gut punch. Over a 20-year period, it is more than 80 times more powerful at trapping heat than CO2. It's the climate crisis on steroids, and right now, the Arctic is gushing methane. Scientists flying over Siberia and Alaska have documented astonishing scenes. In the newly formed thermokarst lakes, the water looks like it's boiling. It's not heat, it's columns of methane gas, trapped for thousands of years, bubbling violently to the surface. In these hotspots, methane concentrations have been measured at 9 times the global average. In some cases, the pressure builds up so much that it explodes outwards, leaving behind those massive craters that have pockmarked the Siberian tundra, some over 100 feet deep. These aren't slow leaks. In some spots, they're full-on methane bombs. Radiocarbon dating of this escaping gas confirms our worst fears. It's ancient. This isn't just carbon from last season's dead grass. This is carbon from woolly mammoths, extinct steppe bison, and plants that haven't seen the sun in 40,000 years. It's a ghost from an ancient atmosphere returning to haunt our own. This creates one of the most feared concepts in climate science, a positive feedback loop. Thawing permafrost releases methane and CO2, which warms the atmosphere. That warmer atmosphere then accelerates the thaw of more permafrost, which releases even more greenhouse gases. It's a vicious cycle that, once it gains enough momentum, could become self-sustaining. We now face the terrifying possibility that the Arctic could flip from being a carbon sink, absorbing carbon, to a massive carbon source, actively amplifying the warming we are trying so desperately to fight. Chilling new research suggests this shift is already underway, and that large parts of the Arctic are now releasing more carbon than they absorb. For a long time, the story of permafrost thaw was about sinking ground and escaping gas, but a new, deeply unsettling chapter is unfolding. The ground isn't just sinking, it's shaking. In Svalbard, the Norwegian archipelago halfway to the North Pole, scientists at an institute that usually listens for earthquakes and illegal nuclear tests started noticing something strange. They were picking up thousands of tiny seismic events, micro-earthquakes that weren't coming from tectonic faults. By analyzing the seismic waves, they made a shocking discovery. The waves were slowing down. Seismic waves travel faster through solid, rigid materials, like ice and frozen rock, and slower through softer, wetter materials. The slowing waves were a direct acoustic signature of the permafrost losing its integrity. The solid ground was turning to mush, and the scientists could literally hear it happening. This process isn't passive. The shift from solid to liquid is violent on a micro level. As ice melts, water seeps into cracks, and the ground settles and shifts, creating tiny fractures and slips. These are the frost quakes that seismic sensors are now picking up by the hundreds of thousands. They are the sound of a world cracking apart. On its own, a landscape having micro-earthquakes is a geological curiosity. But the Arctic is no longer a pristine wilderness. It's an industrial zone. Thousands of miles of oil and gas pipelines, mines, roads, and entire cities are built directly on this supposedly permanent frost. And all of that infrastructure was designed for solid, stable ground. As the earth beneath it shivers and slumps, those foundations are failing. We've seen it in leaning buildings across Siberian cities and roads that look like roller coasters. And we've seen it in catastrophic industrial disasters. The 2020 Norilsk diesel spill, one of the worst environmental disasters in Arctic history, was blamed in part on thawing permafrost causing the supports of a fuel tank to collapse. 21,000 tons of diesel fuel poured into the surrounding rivers, a stark preview of the risks. This seismic instability is a threat multiplier. It turns a sinking foundation into a sudden collapse. It turns a wet slope into a fast-moving landslide, which can trigger a local tsunami if it falls into a fjord. The very ground, once the most reliable feature of the Arctic, has now become one of its greatest and most unpredictable hazards. The escaping carbon and the shaking ground are direct results of melting ice. But what was trapped inside that ice is perhaps the most unnerving part of this whole story. Permafrost is not sterile. It's a perfect deep-freeze time capsule, and inside it are bacteria and viruses that have been locked in suspended animation for an almost unimaginable amount of time. This is where we get to the ancient part of the Arctic's collapse, a threat that sounds like science fiction, but is now the subject of serious investigation. In a French lab, scientists took samples of Siberian permafrost nearly 50,000 years old and carefully thawed them. From that ancient mud, they successfully revived several viruses, quickly nicknamed zombie viruses by the media. The oldest of these, Pandoravirus yodoma, was dormant since the time of the Neanderthals, yet in the lab, it quickly became infectious again. Now, thankfully, these specific revived viruses only infect single-celled amoebas. They pose no direct threat to us. But their revival is a stunning proof of concept. It proves that complex viruses can survive and remain infectious after tens of thousands of years in deep freeze. The researchers who did this weren't trying to start a plague. They were trying to sound an alarm. As they scanned the genetic material from the permafrost, they found the signatures of many other microbes, including relatives of known human pathogens. The question is no longer if ancient pathogens can survive in the permafrost, The question is what happens when they are released on a massive scale into a world whose inhabitants have no immunity to them. We have no idea what our immune systems would do. In 2016, an anthrax outbreak in Siberia that hospitalized dozens, killed a child and over 2,000 reindeer, was traced back to the thawing of an old, infected reindeer carcass that had been encased in the permafrost. And that was a known pathogen. The greatest risk comes from the pathogens we don't even know exist, and it's not just microbes. The permafrost is also a repository for our own industrial pollution. Heavy metals like mercury, released from power plants around the world, travel on atmospheric currents, get deposited in the Arctic, and become trapped in the frozen soil. As the permafrost thaws, this concentrated mercury is released into rivers and lakes, working its way up the food chain, a concentrated dose of our own industrial poison, given right back to us. For the 4 million people who live in the Arctic, this is not a theoretical crisis. It is a daily reality that is dismantling their world. The Arctic's indigenous peoples, whose cultures have been built on the stability of ice and snow for millennia, are on the front lines. Their ancestral lands, hunting routes and sacred sites are literally crumbling into the sea. In communities across Alaska, Canada and Siberia, the very ground is failing them. In places like Nunapitchuk, Alaska, houses are sinking and tilting as the permafrost gives way. The entire village of Newtok, Alaska is being forced to relocate because of chronic erosion and thaw, leaving behind a place that has been home for generations. This isn't just about rebuilding, it's the loss of cultural heritage. Ice cellars, used for generations to store food, are flooding. Traditional burial grounds are being washed away. The impacts ripple through every aspect of life. Roads buckle and fracture, cutting off access to supplies. A trip that was once safe on frozen ground is now a treacherous journey through a landscape of sinkholes and mud. This disrupts food security, as hunting and fishing patterns, honed over centuries, become totally unreliable. There is a profound injustice at the heart of this. The communities facing the most devastating consequence of permafrost, thaw, are the ones who have contributed the least to the climate crisis causing it. Their safety, their homes, their health, and their culture are being sacrificed to a problem they did not create. For them, the collapsing Arctic isn't a future headline. It's the sound of their world disappearing from beneath their feet. Perhaps the most frightening aspect of the Arctic's collapse is its speed. The changes we're seeing today are happening decades ahead of what many older climate models predicted. This acceleration points to the danger of crossing irreversible tipping points. A tipping point is a threshold. Once you cross it, you can trigger a cascade of changes that become self-perpetuating and nearly impossible to stop. The permafrost carbon feedback loop is a prime candidate. Scientists now warn that even if we were to halt all human emissions tomorrow, the momentum already built into the Arctic system could be enough to continue the thaw and the release of greenhouse gases for decades or even centuries. The potential scale is staggering. The carbon released from permafrost thaw could add up to 0.5 degrees Celsius of additional warming by the end of this century. That alone could make limiting global warming to our targets of 1.5 or 2 degrees all but impossible. It's a threat that could single-handedly derail our global climate goals. And what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. The rapid warming there is already being linked to disruptions in weather patterns far to the south, contributing to extreme weather in North America, Europe, and Asia. The collapse of the Arctic is the collapse of a planetary regulator, a system that has helped maintain a stable climate for all of us. We are witnessing a fundamental state change. The Arctic is transitioning from a permanently frozen landscape to a seasonally frozen one, and it's happening in the span of a human lifetime. It's a transformation of geological significance, unfolding at biological speed. The sleeping giant of the North is waking up, and we are only just beginning to comprehend the consequences. Understanding the scale of this problem is the first step. The collapsing ground, the methane flares, the trembling earth, and the awakening of ancient life. This is the true state of the Arctic today. It's more complex, more immediate, and far more threatening than most people realize. The science is no longer about prediction. It is about observation. The collapse is here. But the fate of the Arctic isn't sealed in the permafrost. It's sealed in the choices we make right now. The science is clear. Every fraction of a degree of warming we prevent is a fraction of the Arctic we save from irreversible collapse. The solutions demand a global response on a scale we have not yet managed, a rapid and just transition away from the fossil fuels that are driving this thaw. This isn't a call for despair. It is a call for urgent, informed action. Share this story, not to spread fear, but to spread understanding. The world needs to know what is happening at the top of our planet, because the tremors from the Arctic will eventually be felt by everyone. We have looked into the deep freeze and seen a glimpse of our past. What we found there is an urgent warning about our future. The Arctic is collapsing, and the question that remains is whether we will act decisively enough to stop ourselves from falling with it.